Hey juniors, hope you had a great weekend. I'm going to continue my discussion about World War One. So if you have not already taken the reading quiz, that's the first thing that you should do today. So turn this video off, go take the reading quiz. There is a a Word document that has the quiz on it, and then I've created an answer sheet similar to like I did with the test, the open book test, where you're going to put your answers on the Google Doc answer sheet, so it'll be easier for me to grade that way. So if you haven't done that, go do that really quickly. You've got about 20 minutes to take that quiz. Shouldn't take any longer than that if you are ready to go. If you turn it in a couple minutes late, I'm not going to punish you, but I want you to try to get it finished within that 20-minute period of time. So we're going to continue our discussion about World War I today, and I have my friend Captain America that's here keeping us company. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because this is in large part it should be a review from what you read in your textbook. I've got my textbook here, and I believe we finished off with just a real brief conversation about, there we go, the Spanish flu during World War I. I don't want to go into too much detail about that, but I think I had a picture of Babe Ruth, not Babe Ruth, someone that looked like Babe Ruth up to bat at I think it was a New York game. And had the mask on like we've been wearing, or some of us have been wearing, not all of us have been wearing. So gonna kind of pick up from there. Your reading section in your quiz was over America's jumping into the war, what that looked like, who was involved, what it looked like on the ground, how we ramped up for that war, all of those sorts of things. But the truth be told, by the time the United States was ready to actually put boots on the ground in Europe, they had been fighting for 4 years, 3 years, something like that. So the French, the Germans, the British, the Hungarians, those in the Ottoman Empire, but primarily those on the front line, the French and the German and the British troops that were fighting in the trenches in France, were worn out. The Russian government had collapsed. Tsar Nicholas II had been kidnapped by the Bolsheviks, and they were retreating from the war. So things on the ground for the Allies were pretty dire. Russia was actually fought with the Allies, and so in a sense had Germany and Austria, Hungary surrounded by the Allies. But when Russia leaves the war in 1917, it puts a lot of pressure on that Western Front. There is a movie based on a book called All Quiet on the Western Front, which I have shown parts of in years past. It's a good World War I movie. It's very depressing. It tells it from the German perspective. A lot of time in the trenches. There was a short little video clip that I had you watch from that movie. It's worth watching. There's a couple of things in it that are probably not teenage appropriate, but it's a film that was done in the I'm going to say 70s maybe. So on the scale of naughtiness in movies today, it's pretty mild. But most of the movie focuses on the war and the effects of the war for the German people. All right, I'm going to jump into this, go through as quickly as I can, since again, it is generally a lot of repeat. I'm actually going to renavigate you guys a little bit here so I can take a look at my computer a little bit better. Hello, Cap. I'm going to move Cap over here. All right, so the Americans were called the Doughboys. There is a mystery about why they were called the Doughboys. Your book does actually talk a little bit about why that may be. We don't know for sure. Could have something to do with the belt and the clay that they used to clean their white belts. It could have had something to do with the buttons, the donut-shaped buttons on their uniforms. Not really sure. But nonetheless, they're called the Doughboys. And the military force of World War I, the American force, was called the American Expeditionary Forces. As far as I know, they were not called that in any other war, and I'm not really sure why they were called that during World War I. That's just what I've always known. So AEF for short, that stands for American Expeditionary Forces. They are the ones that are sent abroad to fight in this new war. So I'm having, whoa, Captain America just died. There we go. He keeps falling, and this silly little toy does not secure his shield very well. It keeps popping off. So I'm going to stick him over here. There you go, Cap. You can get real close and personal. There we go. Okay. All right. So I'm going to go through my PowerPoint. And again, as you're doing this lecture, I would encourage you to have the split screen if you can, have me talking on one screen and the PowerPoint on the other. So the first slide in this new venture is actually a picture of the Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. For those of you who are into British history and studying the queens and the monarchies of the British, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany was the, let me see here, he was the first grandson of Queen Victoria from the Victorian era. Her daughter married a German prince and gave birth to Kaiser Wilhelm II. And so all of the monarchies in Europe were related generally one way or the other. You'll notice in the picture I actually have his hand circled. He was born with a basically sort of a handicapped arm. One of his arms was shorter than the other, and he had some problems with his hand. And so in almost all of his pictures, his formal pictures, he is almost always got a sword in his sheath and he's holding onto that sword, or he has his hand in his pocket. He didn't like to show that. When he would greet the troops, again, he would have his hand on that sword, so not to draw attention to the problem. And so I just drew attention to that. So the next slide says, America enters the war, and those are some pictures of some doughboys marching into war. They have that kind of ranger type hat that they wore. It looks a little bit like Smokey the Bear hat that he wears in some of those advertisements for our national parks. And off they go. That second picture of them marching, I believe, is actually in Washington, D.C. I recognize some of those buildings, that French design. And they are marching, they are answering the call to duty. Some more pictures. I love that third picture of them. You can see they are young. They are young men. I think the book said that 1 in 5 Americans that were drafted during the Selective Service Act were foreign-born Americans, so they were immigrants that were living in the United States, effectively American citizens, but had been born abroad. Most of them had no higher education, and that's going to change as we march through time. So just basic education, and they were ready to go. They wanted to go over and fight by the time that they were actually issued the draft, their Selective Service cards. The next picture is a picture of a African American or Black American regiment, and there are all kinds of incredible stories about the Tuskegee Airmen that fought that were Black Americans. I don't know if this is the particular unit, but I think it was the 367th, I think, Black regiment that fought with great distinguishment. And I think the book says they received more awards or they served more battle time on the ground than any American regiment. And they served with distinguished. They received the French's highest honor. They were treated as heroes at the end of the war when they came through Paris and passed through the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. And sadly, most of them came back to a very segregated America where they were treated poorly, were not respected the way that they should have been, although the fact that they were World War I veterans actually did garner them some honor and distinguished respect that they otherwise would not have gotten. So wish we could talk about that longer. Another picture here of just some of the officers. Got their riding boots on. They're probably cavalry. Lots and lots of public relations posters associated with the war effort. The doughboys make good. I think this is a beautiful picture of this officer. Close-up of his buttons was part of the reason I put that picture in there, so you could see his buttons shaped like dough or donuts. Some more pictures. You have the kind of the ranger hat and then the combat hats that you see there. You'll notice that in one of these pictures, one of the guys is standing with a coat on with his hand in, and looks like he's got some riding boots on. And the picture next to that, you see a bunch of American doughboys. But one of the things you'll notice about that picture is they have the gas mask tied around or hanging around their neck, just in case they have a warning that there's going to be a gas attack. All right, so how does America mobilize for this war? Again, assuming you read this section, this is going to sound familiar to you. But for the first time since the Civil War, I think it was the first time since the Civil War, the Selective Service Act, or draft, is issued, and 24 million American men are registered for the draft. Now, obviously, not nearly that many actually served. I think the book said 2 million served, 2 million overseas. It might have been 3 million. I need to go back and look, but 2 or 3 million served. Only about 2/3 of that actually reached Europe. By the time many of them were ready to go, the war was over. It was just a few months. It was about a year of building up and preparing to go to war, and just a few months on the ground once they got over to Europe when the fighting began. And so America was just involved just a tiny bit, but very important that they jumped in when they did. Let's see here. One of the biggest problems that we had as the war began, or as our entrance into the war began, is that because we had taken a neutral stance for all of those years leading up to it. In fact, as we said before, Woodrow Wilson actually ran on the campaign that he kept us out of the war. And so all of a sudden they're like, wow, we don't have the people or the resources. We don't really have the ability to fight this war the way that we want to. And so in particular, training the men, of course, teaching them how to fight in combat and the conditions they would find themselves in was obviously necessary. The book says that many of them trained with sticks and rocks for grenades, sticks for guns, because they did not have the capability or the numbers they needed yet to fight this battle. It kind of reminds me of coronavirus. Hate to bring that up, but here we are fighting this silent enemy, as President Trump calls it, and we are still trying to get up to speed because we were really not prepared because of a whole bunch of things, but false information, a new virus, new pandemic, a novel virus. What will we need? And so we are finally kind of getting to that point where we have enough tests, and we have medicines now that we can introduce to help fight this. But we weren't prepared for it on day one. Who is ever prepared for something like this? Americans probably should have been more prepared to start the fight when they started the fight, except that politically, President Wilson had no interest whatsoever in fighting this war. It was just that events led us in that direction. Unrestricted submarine warfare, the Zimmerman telegram, events led us to that point. So when we finally did declare war, it took a while to get us up and going. And so the men trained, and in the meantime, those who weren't serving in the military in a combat capacity were working in America's factories. The book says that they were encouraged to consider that their contribution to the war effort. Of course, millions of women also entered the workforce, working in the factories and shipbuilding and that sort of thing. Airplanes were not a real big deal at the beginning of the war. They were clearly used in combat, but their use was touch and go. And so creating a huge, massive air force was not necessarily the primary goal, but definitely shipbuilding was. And in large part it was to get our goods and our men safely to Europe, to support the war effort, and also to prevent our ships from being destroyed, our merchant and supply ships from being destroyed by German submarines. And so mass production, shipyard work, value of non-combat participation in the war effort. There's several pictures there. You'll see several pictures of women in the war effort. Let's see here. There's a picture of about 12 ladies at a shipyard factory lined up taking a picture together. It's kind of Rosie the Riveter before Rosie the Riveter. One of the things I want you to notice in that picture, if you get really close up in the picture, look at the shoes they're wearing. And they are wearing coveralls to work in the factory and the plant. Some of them have their hair covered. All of them have their hair up. And most of them are wearing boots. 2 or 3 of the ladies are actually wearing heels. One of them is wearing a pair of white heels. Perhaps she works in the office and not in the factory. But I'm like, wow, they look like workers on the outside. And then you look at their feet and you're like, okay, these are chicks. Let's see, some more propaganda posters. Teamwork wins, encouraging people to do what they can in the war effort. There is an identification badge of a Navy Yard worker with his picture. He probably had to wear that when he went to work. The book talks about how many ships were eventually produced over the course of time. I've got a poster here that shows some of these ship launches. I can't remember the number. I should have looked it up. But in one day, I think it was July of 1918, I think it said. Would that be right? I can't remember now. The number of ships that were released to the ocean in one day was just staggering. And then, of course, we can make a whole bunch of ships, but the problem is that the Germans kept shooting them out of the water. Long before we got into the war, that was happening with the British, and long before we declared war, they were shooting down merchant ships. And these are rudimentary submarines. These are not like the submarines we see today. These are manned by a few dozen men in some cases, and all it takes is one torpedo, and you can destroy a massive ship. And so small rudimentary submarines that could navigate the English Channel, that could navigate the cold waters of the North Atlantic and catch off guard unsuspecting merchant ships had wreaked havoc prior to America entering the war. And so American commanders convinced the British and the French, but primarily the British, who had the big navy, that they needed to start using what was known as a convoy system. Now, the British did not want to move their battleships to protect merchant ships, but honestly, it was quite necessary. And so now that America was entering the war, we could contribute our navy to this process. And that was hugely successful in getting our men, our goods, food supplies, medicines, all kinds of supplies from here over there where it was greatly needed. The book says that of the 2 million men, Americans that made it to Europe, only 600 or so were killed as a direct result of submarine warfare in the Atlantic Ocean, which is crazy, considering how much havoc they had been wreaking previously to that. There's a picture there of a German submarine. You can see there's just a handful of guys that are manning it, that are above water. Pretty rudimentary. Okay, so the American Expeditionary Force gets over to Europe, and I'll tell you one thing that they learned is that they were not going to dig trenches, and they were not going to fight trench warfare. They were going on the offense. They were going to fight. They were going to protect the French and the British and to push the Germans back into their own country. Now, by the time that Germany does surrender, Americans actually never set foot in Germany. Conditions were so bad by that point that Germany ended up surrendering. But the goal was to protect Paris in particular, to defend Paris, and to push the Germans back out of the trenches towards their own country. And so no trench warfare. Now, American medical help, nurses, backup forces and stuff were sent to assist in the trenches as far as where the lines already existed, but American forces were not going in and digging trenches and hunkering down. They were in there to fight. General John J. Pershing was in charge of the AEF, and one of his famous quotes was, "Do not give up even an inch of land." We're not going there to give up even an inch of land. So you fight, you fight, you fight, you don't retreat. And so he was kind of famous for that. Another thing Americans bring to the battle, as I mentioned before, the French and the British are exhausted. They've been living in those disgusting conditions in the trenches, giving up a mile, taking a mile, giving up a mile, taking a mile in that no man's land between the trenches. Really of no consequence, nothing, no significant advance. And so Americans came ready to fight. They've been training for 8 or 9 months. They're proud, they're patriotic, they want to go in and save the day. And they do. And so they bring with it fresh enthusiasm, fresh resolve to win this battle. They're not tired, they're not sick, they're not unhealthy. They're well fed, they're psychologically prepared for war, even though this is not their fight, really. It's not their land, it's not their country, it's not their political systems. It is their trading partners, it is their family, it is their European allies that they're fighting for, but they're not fighting for Empire. They're not fighting because we've been attacked per se, although our pride has been hurt, and figuratively we've been attacked, but our physical land has not been attacked, like at Pearl Harbor in World War II. And so let's see here. Some of the things they're going to encounter once they get there that has not been an effective part of war as of yet was a pretty refined machine gun. Machine guns had been used prior to this, but not on this scale and not this type of refined machine gun. And so you're going to see significant casualties as a result of that. Tanks were probably the most significant introduction to battle during World War I. I have some pictures of some rudimentary tanks. Nothing like we got now. There's a cool picture on the PowerPoint of General, he was I think a lieutenant colonel at the time, George Patton, who is famous in World War II. He's also famous in World War I. He got the gig in World War II because of his game in World War I. But he is rock star, tank combatant officer. He knows how to use those tanks effectively. Americans end up, we didn't have our own tanks, and so we used a French Renault tank, I think it was. There's a picture of him in front of one, and he used it very well and very successfully. Of course, tanks were used to pave the way for the infantry, for the American Expeditionary Forces. So oftentimes they were at the front line, getting bombarded by shelling and other things. And so tanks were very, very important. They were mechanized. They used gas or diesel fuel. Of course, airplanes, as I mentioned before, are introduced. The beginning of the section that you read talked about Eddie Rickenbacker. I always think of Matthew Reichenbach, but Eddie Rickenbacker, yeah. He was probably America's most famous ace. He had, I don't know, 30 or so kills. Maybe it was more than that. Actually, I think it was 27 or 26 planes that he shot down. But we have to remember that airplanes were not used in the same capacity in World War I that they were used in World War II. So to say, oh, he only shot down 27 airplanes, in this setting, that was incredible. Initially, when airplanes were first used in battle, they were primarily used for kind of scouting, to kind of see the positions of the troops. They were used to protect the balloons, the observation balloons that were used significantly to look at troop movement and that sort of thing. Of course, the troops weren't doing a lot of moving. They were sitting in trenches. So, when they were first introduced into the fight, pilots had guns in their hands and they're shooting at each other, pistols. Of course, with the propeller on the front of the airplane, using a machine gun is a death sentence because you're going to destroy your own propeller. The Germans came up with a delay propeller where it would stop, shoot, and then it would start up again. That would scare me to death. So anyway, as the war progressed, they kind of figured it out a little bit more. By the time we get to World War II, airplanes change everything. Aircraft carriers change everything. But during this war, they're just being introduced. There's a picture of Eddie Rickenbach. He actually was a race car driver prior to entering the war and decided, hey, I think I'll learn to fly. He learned on his own. Well, I think he learned in England. And he took it up, and he was already famous actually as a race car driver. Most of the photos of him, he looks like a movie star, and that's because he sort of was. He was kind of an icon in American culture, and then he became a hero as a result of the war, and he survived the war. His arch nemesis, the Red Baron. I'm gonna look up his name. Manfred. I just forgot his name. Hold on. There he is. There is Manfred von Richthofen, I'll just call him the Red Baron. He also is something movies are made of. The images that you'll see of him are just pictures of him in military regalia. He was a war hero in Germany. He was the leader of the squadron called the Flying Circus. That was just phenomenal pilots. And the Red Baron actually dies towards the end of the war. He's shot and manages to land his plane and breathes his last on the ground, I believe. But he's a very handsome man. His brother is going to go on and serve in the Nazi Party in the high command military I think maybe even in the SS. I have to look that up. It's been a while since I looked at that. But his brother goes on to serve in World War II. But the Red Baron is actually killed at the end of World War I. But there's some really neat pictures of him as well. All right. Let me go back up here. And then I mentioned observation balloons. I did put one picture in here of I think it's a German observation balloon. They were very, very critical, but like I said, there wasn't a lot of movement during the war. They are not going to be used in any significance during World War II. They're flammable. Modern warfare is not going to allow that. So we'll talk about the Hindenburg disaster later. And then, of course, unfortunately, another weapon of war that is introduced are chemical weapons. So fortunately, we didn't use chemical weapons as a civilization during World War II, although chemicals were used in the concentration camps. There have been world leaders in the Middle East, for instance, Bashar al-Assad of Syria, Saddam Hussein of Iraq, that have used chemical weapons in warfare in the modern era with just horrible, devastating effects. Unfortunately, it's because in those situations, it was primarily civilian casualties in the thousands of people that had died as a result of it. So it is considered immoral to use chemical weapons in warfare amongst civilized societies today. And so America does not use chemical weapons. You know, our allies don't use chemical weapons. Chemical weapons we would say, are used by terrorists. All right, let me zip through here. Just again, to summarize some of the stuff in your chapter, there were a lot of physical consequences of this sort of fighting and warfare. Trench foot, which was a result of being in the trenches in the wet, cold climate and your socks never drying out. That's a real bad case of athlete's foot. I shouldn't laugh. It led to amputations. It led to handicap, disabilities, horrible situation. There was also trench mouth that would create infections in your mouth as a result of the damp weather. Shell shock was a huge side effect of it. Just the constant shelling that took place out on the trenches sometimes for days where you had no relief. A lot of men, we would call that today probably PTSD. Back then they called it shell shock. And then of course the side effects of the poison gas could be everything from blindness to just severely damaged lungs where you're not really able to function anymore, to slow loss of life as a result of the damage to your lungs and your respiratory system where you don't die immediately, but eventually you do. A lot of people suffered from blindness as a result of the mustard gas and other gases. Okay, it's funny how the book treats warfare. Just a very, very brief mention of the battles that Americans were involved in. I'm not going to go into too much detail about them. I'm not going to require you to really even know them, other than just being familiar with they were short, powerful, offensive, successful by the Americans to repel the Germans, and it ultimately led the Germans to surrender. Again, I cannot reiterate this enough, however. The absence of Russian forces on the eastern perimeter of the German, Austrian-Hungary Empire when Russia withdraws from the war is catastrophic to the French and British cause. Fortunately for the French and the British, America showed up as Russia was withdrawing or shortly thereafter. And so as those German forces were moving from the east to west to reinforce that Western front, America shows up to fight. Though German troops are still just bushed from, fighting the Russians, and America is fresh and ready to go. The first major battle that America was involved in, or offensive, was called, I'm going to totally botch this, the Battle of Cantigny, which was in May of 1918. And so, again, you just almost have, let's see here, just a few months on the battlefield before the war comes to an end. And so I'm going to jump over to something really quick. I need to check a date. I think I have the wrong date written here. Just a second. Oh, I was right. Okay. I wanted to make sure I didn't have the date wrong. All right. So Let me go back to this. And so the Battle of Cantigny was fought in May of 1918. About 1,000 Americans died in that offensive. Next, there were the battles of Chateau Thierry, Bellewood, Marne. All of these three, those are the three most significant battles, or four, I guess. They all take place in the spring and summer of 1918. Okay, so the war started all the way back with the Archduke assassination in 1914. So we're 4 years removed from that now. America is just now fighting. And honestly, we kicked their butt. And the Germans, they could not maintain the fight anymore. They were drafting 13, 14, 15-year-old kids and 50 and 60-year-old men. They lost the bulk of their German young men in this fight. And so finally, actually, Austria-Hungary surrendered first, but then shortly thereafter, I think it was in November, it was in November of 1918. So again, just a few months after America is on the ground, essentially the Kaiser is asked to leave the country. He leaves the country. A republic is formed. Several leaders within Germany reach out to the Allies and say, "We're done. We're ready to surrender. Whatever the terms are, we're done." And so an armistice is arranged, and an armistice essentially is a agreement to quit fighting, to lay down your arms, until a formal peace treaty can be signed. And so the armistice was signed and went into effect in the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918. So 11/11, 1918. That became known as Armistice Day. Eventually, we changed it to Veterans Day. And so we always celebrate Veterans Day, remembering those who served in military in the United States, on the 11th of November, which used to be called Armistice Day. And so a calm, a quiet fell across the trenches. Men continued to stay in the trenches and protect their stations. And then ultimately, the Treaty of Versailles was signed in Paris, France, which brought an end to the war. And so I'm going to segue just very briefly to the Treaty of Versailles. Before I do that, I'm just going to list some of the costs of the war, and there's a PowerPoint that actually lists these. So 22 million people died during the war on all sides. Half of these were civilians. An additional 20 million people suffered wounds as a result of the war. 10 million refugees were caused as a result of the war. 48,000 Americans were killed in battle. 62,000 ended up dying from wounds or disease as a result of the battle. So a little over 100,000. An additional 200,000 Americans were wounded, suffered consequences from nerve gas or complications to amputations, those sorts of things. Entire empires were destroyed. The Austrian-Hungary Empire disappears. The Ottoman Empire disappears. Europe is essentially remapped. Eastern Europe, of course, communism comes in and takes over Eastern Europe. Let's see here. There's political unrest everywhere as all of these nations are trying to figure out, what do we do now? Our empires have collapsed. Socialism, fascism, communism all begin to climb up out of the gutter. Economic systems are completely destroyed in large parts of the known world. And so it's great that the war is over, but we got some problems, which is actually going to lead to World War II. I'm going to flip to another slide here. So you don't need to know these dudes, but I'm just going to list them. There's the pictures of the four world leaders they're known as the Big Four. The Premier of France, George Clemenceau, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, David Lloyd George, Prime Minister of Italy, Vittorio Orlando, and President Woodrow Wilson decided to put their heads together and try to come up with a plan to end the Great War. President Roosevelt is famous for his 14 points. 14 points to world peace. If you recall, Woodrow Wilson said, "I want this to be the war that ends all wars," the war to end wars. And so he thought these 14 points, if the whole world would agree to them, that we could, as humanity, avoid another war. Unfortunately, what ends up happening is the way that the war is settled ends up setting up World War II and another catastrophic world war event. But Wilson's ideal plan included no secret treaties between nations, freedom of the seas for all nations. He believed in free trade, get rid of all tariffs so you can trade with whoever you want to. He believed in a worldwide reduction of war weapons, arms, that sort of thing. He thought that in this era of empire building that mother countries needed to take into consideration the concerns of colonized people. Let's see here, and then I didn't even list 6 through 13, which gets a little bit in the weeds, so to speak. And unfortunately, the very final part of the 14 points was something called the League of Nations, which was going to effectively be sort of like a United Nations, where you have this world organization that sends representatives to this world body where they hash out all the problems and figure out how to solve the world's problems without leading to war. On paper, that sounds ideal. In reality, as much fighting goes on in the boardrooms of the United Nations as happened on the battlefield. And some of the decisions that are made in the United Nations today, it costs the lives of millions of people around the globe. It's a good idea, but the reality is it's a not recognizing the condition of the human heart, and that at the root we are evil. And as the Bible says, there is a time for all things under the sun. There is a time for peace and there's a time for war. There are times when you actually have to pick up a gun and defend yourselves. You don't want to have to resort to that. I wish that we lived in peace all of the time, but until Jesus comes back, the reality is war is here to stay. If we can avoid it, we're called to be peacemakers. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall inherit the earth. But the reality is there are times when there are reasons and causes that you must pick up a gun or whatever and defend yourself, defend your fellow man against a greater evil. And I would say that Woodrow Wilson, even though he was a Christian man, failed to recognize this. Kudos for him for trying. He was trying to be a peacemaker, but unfortunately it didn't work. The only part of his 14 points that was accepted on his worldwide tour of Europe, when he met with all of these world leaders to figure out this peace treaty to end the war, was the League of Nations. That's the only thing that survived. And the irony of all irony, once that peace treaty was crafted and none of the 14 points were included except for the League of Nations, the United States Senate refused to accept the peace treaty. The United States never signed the Treaty of Versailles. We never negotiated a peace treaty with those we fought against. We essentially left it to them, which is really, really interesting. It's unfortunate as well because it prevented us from intervening in the circumstances in Europe that led to World War II, because we became isolationists. We didn't want to get involved. And so the world leaders meet in Versailles, which is outside of Paris, France, to sign the Treaty of Versailles, which is going to effectively end World War I. The Germans get thrown under the bus. Effectively, they have to sign a guilt clause saying that they are responsible for World War I and all of the damage. They have to pay reparations to all of the Allies for the damage caused. Essentially Germany is put in a situation where there's no way to recover. They've lost their monarch. They've formed a new, an unusual form of government for them. They are going to be struck with huge reparation payments, basically a huge, massive debt. The inability to pay for it. They have to take out loans from America to pay their debt to the British so that the British can pay America back. The loans from the war. It's an utter mess. And it causes the German people to be angry and resentful, and ultimately it gives them cause to elevate this psychomaniac named Adolf Hitler to the highest position in their land. And so the Versailles Treaty is in large part responsible for the events that led to World War II. There are some pictures in the PowerPoint of beautiful Versailles. It is a beautiful palace. It was the palace to King Louis the 16th, who got his head cut off, and I actually in memory of the Versailles event, I have here one of my favorite cups ever given to me. It was given to me by a student, junior, a few years ago, and it says, "Let them drink coffee," and that is Marie Antoinette, who famously also lost her head, but she was she said that, supposedly, let them eat cake at the Versailles Palace when the French people stormed Versailles. Anyway, I'm digressing. There's some beautiful pictures here of Versailles. If you ever have a chance to go to France, go to Paris, there are a lot of day trips to Versailles. It's definitely worth going and seeing. It's fantastically beautiful. The treaty was signed in the Hall of Mirrors. There's a picture there of the people congregating around the world leaders who are signing it. And so this is essentially what the price that Germany had to pay according to the Versailles Treaty. 9 new nations would be established, carving out the old Ottoman Empire. France and Great Britain were going to be the mandates of those lands. And so Israel, Jordan, Syria, Turkey, I think, parts of North Africa, I believe, became provinces of either the French or the British. Germany was not allowed to have an army, according to the treaty. No army for you. They had to pay $33 billion at that time in reparation to the Allies. They were forced to sign a war guilt clause. Germany lost all of its Pacific colonies. And in a strange turn of events, Russia, who was not at the Treaty of Versailles because the Bolsheviks and the communists had taken over the country, Russia ended up actually losing more land as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, as everything was kind of carved out, than Germany did, which is very interesting. The legacy of the war, I'm just going to list this and then we're going to call it quits. The U.S. government grew tremendously during the war. The U.S. military proved itself to be a world power. The role of women and African Americans changed in America. The first communist country, USSR, is formed. Fascism spreads to other countries like Italy, Spain, and Germany. The world becomes mechanized on a more rapid pace as a result of the war. Airplanes, cars, advanced military systems, and the stage for World War II is set. And then their last couple slides here are pictures of the chain reaction. It's got the assassination of the Archduke in World War I, which leads to worldwide depression. Worldwide depression leads to revolution, such as we saw in Russia, Stalin, Hitler, Mussolini, the rise of Adolf Hitler, the Holocaust, and ultimately the United States enters World War II, and 30 million more people are killed worldwide. And so I believe World War I and World War II are connected. I believe one leads to the other. And so we call them World War I and World War II. I would like to call them the Great Wars because they're so connected. Whew, okay. Final instructions. Make sure that if you see any film strip, any video links, that you watch them as you're going through this PowerPoint. It helps to watch them when they actually pop up. And then lastly, let's see. Your homework assignment that I want you to have completed before class on Wednesday is actually a movie. I want you to watch a movie called Iron Jawed Angels, and it is a movie about the women's right to vote, or the suffragette movement, that takes place during World War I and is culminated right after World War I. It's a really, really interesting take. It's actually a theatrical presentation. It's not boring. It's very interesting. So treat it like a movie. I will have a few questions for you. Writing prompts at the beginning of class on Wednesday that you'll have to do without assistance at the very beginning of class. So that's sort of our next world event. And then on class, after we take do those writing prompts on Wednesday, we're going to do a real quick overview of our next significant event in U.S. history, and that is the Great Depression. So not to be confused with the Corona Depression, but the Great Depression. And so, love you guys. I am getting through grading, so keep checking RunWeb. I made a pretty significant dent yesterday with my AP kids, so hang in there. We've got 4 weeks of school left. You got this. Bye.